Welcome back to another episode here of Survival Worldwide on Reality Pop. Riley and we're both joined here today by Cara from Survivor, the Duchess of Double Bay. How are you, Cara?
I'm fabulous. Duchess is going well, thank you.
How's things sort of been settling back into your normal life since playing Survivor? And the fandom, I guess, of Survivor is pretty crazy. How's it been dealing with that since you've played the game?
Well, I think there's two questions or two answers in that. One, coming back to reality is actually really tough. You get a bit institutionalized out there and you're so used to seeing just brown and blue. Coming back to all the smells and the colors of even our phones and even just Woolies trolleys, it's actually really quite overwhelming. And I understand you do get a bit institutionalized out there. So it's definitely changed me as a person. And I was talking a lot slower and walking a lot slower, which is also interesting because we always say that about country people.
Yeah, you bring up a good point because you were out there for 40 plus days without a phone, without being on
Yeah.
social media. We're also connected these days.
Yeah.
What is it like just picking up your phone and going on the internet and having to deal with all of the noise around this season when it sort of aired?
Yeah. So my most exciting thing was getting back my wallet because you do get a form of it's almost like a Stockholm syndrome. So getting back my wallet, I was like walking into Woolies going, oh my God, I can literally buy whatever I want with my own money and no one will say no. And I think that was one of the biggest things. And I just ran through the whole fresh food section because I just craved vitamin C, frankly. I went through liters and liters of cranberry juice of all things, and oranges and mandarins. And I just wanted like vitamin C, I think.
Going into the show, what was your experience with Survivor beforehand? Have you been a fan since day one, since Borneo or the Australian Outback, or a relatively newer fan?
Oh, do you know what? Australian Outback, I did watch it, but I don't think that would make anyone a fan, frankly. My husband and I watched the American ones for sure. There's a handful in there that we missed, especially if they were just at awkward times or awkward channels, when they got a little bit less so. But we've been fans since way back, and probably Boston Rob is my most favorite. And yeah, so massive fan. I applied about 3 years ago. I didn't get in because I was too close in sort of my archetype to Janine Ellis, just being a businesswoman, sort of a mother duck kind of situation. And I was devastated. And I have to say, I didn't watch that Champions versus Contenders because I was so sad. I couldn't do it. And I would have loved to have played with her. Anyway, I got the chance to meet her or chat to her, which was perfect. And I think now I can go back and watch it without being too sad.
So obviously, if you did play in that season, you would have been a champion, but you get into this season and you play as a Brains. What did you think of the theme coming into this season being Brains versus Brawns?
Well, when they announced the theme to me on the phone, I kind of said to them, which one am I? Whilst I'm certainly not a world champion, I'm okay for my age, but I've also got the brains. So even my husband said, which one were you? And I kind of gave him a little punch in the arm going, what do you mean? But we could have gone either way. But I have to say I'm relationship based and that needs brains, that needs strategy. So I certainly didn't want to go in there without any brains. So I was happy for that.
Headed into the game early on, obviously very overwhelming with 11 new tribe mates that you're forced to live with, really. Who did you sort of gravitate towards over those first couple of days there?
Probably the first day, it was always my intention to make an alliance very quickly, one solid one. I know you have been speaking with others, and so that the tribe was quite divided in terms of people who were just resting on their laurels. So I gravitated towards Mitch. I actually really liked Mitch. I thought he was very upright and like he was a straight talker. I really like Baden. Baden and I used to talk business all the time, which I really enjoy. I really realized out there how much I missed talking about property and business and finance and all that thing. And talking about nature is lovely, but I was just like, can we stop talking about the birds for a moment and actually just like talk about interesting stuff? So again, probably Baden and Mitch were my first ones. I really liked Haley, but I didn't know Haley's position in the first few days. And George, we're all trying to work him out. I don't know if you wanted me to segue into the tribal council where I finally got him, understood him, was that first one where he saved us. And I was staring at him and I thought, he's hamming it up a little bit, and he's half joking but half serious. So there were a few little jags in there, and I thought, okay, I get George. So it was pretty much after that moment that I understood George as well.
So, sort of two questions there. Did you expect George to sort of save you there? How much of a surprise was that for you? And then, secondly, learning that Phil was the person that was sent home in that first spot, what was Phil's sort of position within the game?
Wei didn't perform well in that very first challenge. Unfortunately, she was meant to be up calling and no one knew what was going on and she was freaking out. So she was actually on the chopping block for that. So George, if he hadn't saved Wei, then she probably would have gone for that reason. She was overwhelmed. Your other question, sorry, because you have multiple questions in your questions.
Sorry, so that was around the being saved by George. How much of a surprise was that? Since it sounded like you guys didn't have that much of a close relationship or didn't talk that much prior to going into that tribal council. So was it quite a big shock for you going into that?
It was a shock. So I did speak with George, but not about that for sure. I speak to everyone. I like to keep my my channels open, frankly, just in case. And you just never know when you might, frankly, not use a relationship, but utilize your relationship with someone later on. So I try not to burn bridges unless I know particularly I have no interest in dealing with those people in the future. So yes, I was surprised about George, but he and I had been chatting, but certainly not about that. My immediate knee-jerk response was, I didn't get to do one of my Survivor bucket list and actually go into the voting booth. That was actually my thing, which was very bizarre. Because I had this whole list of things in my head that I wanted to do. And a lot of people are saying it takes away your control and you have so little control over there. So there was a bit of that. But when we got back to camp after that and he explained it in his clumsy little way, I started to understand it. And frankly, who wouldn't want to be saved? Really, logically, everyone wants to, have an easy ticket to the next one. No one wants to be first out. So I understand the whole thing, understand the dynamic, and it was what it was. So
now you came into the show as both an empath and somebody that works in real estate sales. How much did that help you, and did you combine the two in those early days to form those relationships that would carry you deep into the game?
I definitely did. I'm so relationship based, and I actually don't prefer, as a rule, small talk. I'm happy to, of course, but I actually really like people and I like delving deep. And so I used to delve deep with a lot of people. Wei, in the very first instance, we came back from the first challenge where she was so silenced. And I used to help her try and find her voice and be a powerful woman. I'm a massive advocate for just helping people grow in their lives, let alone just in the game. And I'm a really big believer in just generosity and giving things to people. And eventually, it may or may not come back. But it's to give without expecting back at all. I like watching and helping people grow, like my team. So in real estate, I grow my team. I'm all about psychology. I studied it for a little while, and I pretty much read a lot of the books. Don't really read fiction as much because I like all the psychology behind it. Coupled in with the empath stuff literally meant if I was sitting next to someone or lying there sleeping next to someone, I just could tap in and I'd go, oh, well, that person has anger issues. And then I'd know how to deal with them better. I wouldn't necessarily tell them, and I certainly wouldn't be telling others what is going on with personal kind of information unless I had approval. But I can feel physical pain, and like deep-rooted emotions. I'm not a mind reader, though. I don't know who they're going to vote for. I just know if they're wounded from their mother or their father, emotionally, or sister issues. I'm certainly not a mind reader, which I think people were getting a bit confused at. And I'm a normal person. I'm sort of not I'm tempted to say a crystal eating, but I do like crystals. I'm a normal, down-to-earth person who just has this ability. That's probably what I want to say about that.
Obviously, being left out of the first tribal council, not the best thing in terms of actually getting your feet in the game. And obviously, as you said, ticking off that bucket list item there and getting in
Yeah.
the voting booth. And you guys won, I think, 3 straight challenges from then on. How did that sort of impact your position within the game? Because we saw after a couple of days, you began to get in a bit of a relationship there with George within the game.
Yeah.
Did you sort of recognize him as being someone you wanted to jump in with then? Or where did you see the hierarchy sort of taking it?
The hierarchy was always the cool kids, and we never knew who was at top of that cool kids kind of realm. Obviously, you had Joey and Laura were super tight, and they just used to, frankly, just have fun and laugh. And Georgia was in and out of that. There was one point where I didn't know where I stood with Georgia. I didn't know whether she was lying. And I do what I do, and I kind of pushed her a little bit because she was saying stuff, frankly, off camera, and I was trying to make her say it on. And I managed to push her off the pot, if you will, and worked out that I couldn't trust her. So that was the end of that, any building that I would have with that. I was trying to cool Mitch's jets because he had a bugbear against, George. And frankly, George was very good at riling people up and pushing their buttons, which is what he does. And I'm usually the relationship person around the back trying to quell it all and smooth it. So I was trying to tell Mitch just to stop getting emotional about George. George and I had become closer because we were sort of being ostracized a bit, particularly because I was attaching myself to George because I got him. He's super smart. He's a mile a minute, but I'm a bit more easygoing, but I'll call him out. And I don't think he's called out a lot, but I also don't think people give him enough time. So again, sorry, I started to ramble on, but there were multiple questions in there. And then I've just Baden and I again. I'm a Tour de France fan, and I'm a Formula One fan. So as soon as I worked out Baden was Baden, I was really excited, and we used to talk about the Tour and Formula One, and again business. So Baden and I and George were kind of on the outer. Rach was a bit on the outer at that point. But then you had the cool kids.
Now, your relationship with George, obviously, like you mentioned, he got stronger as the time went on. And there's the very famous episode prior to you swapping over to the Brawns tribe where you actually play an idol for George, which ultimately ends up with you going home. Can you talk us through a little bit of the strategizing going into that tribal council, and maybe why you played the idol? Was it a misread, or were you aware that there was a good chance that you would be sacrificing your game for him this early on?
I knew exactly what I was doing, and you'll note at Tribal, when I said to Baden, I'm actually going to do that. He was the only one that I literally told at Tribal. George didn't know, no one knew. And because I'm such a fan, I had given up so much to go on the show. I work with my husband. I'm leaving behind 3 teens who were struggling through kind of lockdown situations with COVID, struggling through school. We're also co-parenting, so there's a lot I do. My team, we're going to be struggling. So it was a big deal, like everyone, a big sacrifice to me to go on there. And as you're aware, if I'm an Uber fan, I'm certainly not going to get to the end of that journey and just be miserable and go, why the hell am I on this journey when it's just nasty and horrible? So it was actually at that point that I just thought, forgive all the fans out there, but there's no point sacrificing my sanity and not standing up for myself and other people and, showing people that, whatever it is, I still have principles and morals, and I'm just not going to let people be walked over. And if that meant giving people an example and a sample of what someone should do, then if I was sacrificing myself, then I was true to myself. My business and my integrity are important. And I said this at the time to JLP, money, the prize money is a lot of money. And obviously the title is amazing. I would have loved to have had that, but I'm older and established. It's not going to change my life for that purpose. And there's a lot of other people there that would benefit. And, don't ruin my journey. Don't make my journey horrible. So that's why I wanted to give it to George. And oh, it actually makes me a bit emotional even now. I don't think anyone has given him something like that ever. And that's what made me particularly proud. And
I just want to add that. I just want to add, for me as a fan watching that, I don't get emotional very often when I watch Survivor. I'm very stone cold, but I got very emotional watching that, and it was such a great moment. I reckon it's going to go down in Australian Survivor history as one of the most selfless acts ever, even though you got a second chance in the game. I just want to say, well, like, I understand how some fans might look at that and say it's not a great game move, but obviously when you're out there playing the game, it's a lot harder, like you said, compared to watching it on the sidelines. Riley, I think you had a question. Sorry, I just wanted to tell you, for me, that was a great moment that I'll always remember from Australian Survivor.
Yeah, and absolutely echo Chris's sentiments there. And that friendship between you and George was really one of the more iconic of the show. You guys being viewed as one of the most iconic alliances in Australian Survivor history. That alliance really was unbreakable. But when you swapped to the Brawn tribe, what was the sort of difference in attitude there at the Brawn camp? Because it did seem like you were received a lot better at the Brawn tribe camp straight away, as opposed to the Brains camp. Were there less fractures on the Brawn tribe? Is that what made it more kumbaya?
Do you know what? It was less about fractures and more about the individuals, because people can separate the game versus the human. And I think in the Brain tribe, people couldn't separate that. If you're on like an easy wicket in the Brains tribe and you don't have to like work with people you don't like, for example, or you think you're on an easy wicket, then you won't. Now, with the Brawn tribe, they were just much more comfortable within their own selves. I found them more confident. And when I mean more confident, I don't mean egotistical confident. They're aware of their flaws, but they acknowledge them. They go, I might not be the brightest one here, or I might not be good at this. I'm great at maths, but I'm not good at that. And being self-aware is much more important to me than pretending you're something you're not, or frankly, like teamwork. They were so team-based and team-driven, even though they had alliances in there. There were fractures, but they were game fractures. And there was a tiny little bit of a personality conflict with some of them, obviously. You're always going to get that. But they were still willing to work together as a team at that point.
Now, while you were there on the Brawns tribe, you had that great scene of you using your empath abilities, talking to Big D and also Shannon within the tribe. What was your relationships like with the people around there, and who were the people that you were closest with that you think you would have been able to work with if you didn't get to swap again after that? And do you think you would have been the next person in line to go, or do you think you did enough?
I definitely wasn't the next one in line to go. Everybody wanted me on there. They also knew that I had no interest in working with some of those brains that I'd left behind. And my job, as I saw it, was to forge new relationships in which I could drag over, automatic votes in George and Baden, if Baden hadn't blown his game up. And so I was very close with Emmett. Emmett and I used to, frankly, I used to help Emmett a lot in terms of understanding his past, history of hurts and things like that. And I was reading him. I was reading Big D. I read Chelsea a bit later on, and I got her ear thing because eventually it worked out she had labyrinthitis. It's fun. Like, it does connect people, and people are always shocked. And even Danny came up to me one time and she said, read me. We want to know if you know what injury I got today. And I'm like, okay, I'm reading her and I'm just touching it on my body. I'm going, it's kind of like a needle. Excuse me. And she's like, yes. So it people who feel understood and acknowledged, you get a greater connection with. And that's always my key, is to dive in deep with people. And going back to your original question, I had less baggage with me, and I was a good solid number, a good loyal number. And Emmett and Gerald knew that. Your original question was Flick. I would have liked to work with Flick a bit more. She was a gorgeous girl. She is a gorgeous girl. And Shannon is my biggest miss. I would have loved to work with her a lot more. And frankly, Simon's a lovely chap. and he got a bit of a bad edit, particularly with that that menopause edit.
With obviously the tribe swap onto returning to the Brains camp, and you're reunited with George there. Obviously, your closest ally in the game,
Yes.
and also the trio of Laura, Georgia, and Rachel. Did you have some inkling to go back to the Brains tribe and work with people like Rachel? Because I know you said that you at some point were connected with her in the game, and she was a little bit on the outs. Or were you really all in on this Brawn tribe now at this point because you felt more well received over there?
I definitely felt more well received at the Brawn tribe, and at one point George was trying to swap over. So no, I was quite brawny by that stage, and I knew who I wanted to work with, who I could trust, who got me as well. And again, people who kind of trample on the little people are not my tribe. I always, it's that old story, be careful, what is it? Be careful who you walk over on the way up the ladder, because you might be passing them on the way back down. So I go back to it. I'm so relationship based and driven until it comes a point, because I'm not a doormat, that it's just, I just don't want to work with that person. So my whole thing was to keep in a strong alliance with the Brawns and pick off Brains.
And obviously that Brawn alliance was very strong. And I've got to bring it up, obviously, because it was a huge turning point in the game for that alliance there. You flipped your vote to Laura, which obviously caused Danny to go home as the collateral damage. Really unfortunate there. Were there mixed messages that we didn't see in the edit? Was there another plan in play at one point? Or had the waters been muddied a little bit there?
Yeah, 1,000,000%. If you go back and actually watch the show, you can see we're all talking over a day or two about which different plans to do. And at the very end of that, Gerald actually said, so we're going to vote Laura. Now, what those two plans were based on was whether Big D was leaving or not. So he'd been talking to people all day, and I was trying to help him. And he just wasn't happy in the Brains physical camp. He didn't want to move there. He wanted to stay as it was. He didn't like the change. So the plan was based on whether he was going to be there at tribal or leaving after or thereabouts. He was speaking to producers all day. And so you can see it actually at tribal, where I turned to Big D and I'm like, plan A, plan B, meaning, are you going or are you not? And he's like, chill. And I turned to Emmett. I'm like, mate, plan A or plan B? And he's just like, relax, Cara, stop stressing. And I'm thinking, I don't work in assumptions at all. My business and my life kind of depend on it for my work. And so I turned around to George. I'm like, plan B? Anyway, George is like this. I'm like, okay, plan B it is. So that's why I voted Laura. And that's why I also came clean about it. And that's why there was no backlash for me, because everyone knew that story behind it. Everybody knew. So if I did that on purpose, I would have been out next, I think, or the following. But Emmett and Gerald and Kez and everyone, and even Big D, obviously he was gone, but everyone knew what was going on. But having said that, it worked out in George and our best interests anyway. So
100%. I think it worked out in everybody's best interest in the Brain side in any case, because they had one less number going into the merge. I did want to ask you about the special advantage that you got. And, you got quite a lot of advantages while you were on the game. You got idols and things like that. There's always these accusations from very casual fans out there that it gets planted and it's very easy to find for certain players within the game. Can you talk us through your process of looking for these idols and advantages, and what were you looking out for, and what were you doing differently compared to some other people out there potentially in regards to finding them?
So the first thing is, we're actually looking everywhere I'd walk at any point in time. I'd be constantly darting my eyes around, and I was just looking for something unusual, something that stood out that wasn't sort of natural. That very first idol, it took George and myself, it was 3 days of looking. The other guys were just in camp laughing and carrying on. I'm a worker. I've always been a worker. After the wood was, collected and the fire's on and the food's ready, what else is there to do, I think, except look for idols? I never thought I'd be really amazing in challenges. I'm like I'm now 48-year-old woman against world champions. So again, I wasn't going to rest on my laurels. I found out later that very first, the tree of knowledge I found that without a clue. There was a clue around, but I didn't know about it at the time. But again, it literally took us 3 days, and I was just about to give up. I was saying to George, it's just heartbreaking looking with a stick and poking for hours and hours and hours, every spare hour you got. So yeah, we just systematically went through, and I just kind of go, where do I feel like it is? That's how it starts. And then I would just overturn every rock, and you kind of get domestic blindness for the rocks. So you start to see things. Some of the rocks actually look like clumps of paper. It was very bizarre. With the advantage, I'm a little bit of an eagle eye, hawkeye anyway. I really have to pay attention to detail in my floor plans and my CGIs and my copy. So I'm a Virgo, so I'm constantly looking for exceptions. And I can read computer programming. I don't know why. I just have this weird ability. So I'm constantly looking for exceptions. And when I got into the candy store, I actually went round because I didn't want to touch everybody's food, but I got a big stick and I was what do you call it? That's like a big not a toothpick, skewer, excuse me, a big skewer. And I was poking it into everything as fast as I could. And it actually had one of the little beads in the tube. And I saw the bead and I knew straight away, because that was obviously my whole, my main purpose was not to eat, but was to look for everything. And we only had 5 minutes each in there at a time. But then I had to work out how to get it out. And so getting it out actually took me a little bit of time. And eventually I worked out I could lift the tube. And then I thought, I'm not going to leave this one tube open. So I actually opened up a couple of the other tubes and did a bit of messing around too, just so it wouldn't look so obvious that one tube was just completely obliterated and on the floor.
I do have another question around the advantages and the idols before we go into the next bit of play where you went to the Brawns tribe. One of my biggest fears is snakes. Now obviously being out there, you're going to come across snakes quite a lot. How often did you stumble across them when you were looking for advantages and things like that? And did you have Andrew quite close by to help in those cases?
There was one time when we were waiting to go into the challenge down at Chineman's Dam, and it was earlier on, and we were literally just waiting. And I think it was an olive snake went past, and Baden jumped up. He's like, there's a snake. And so we all just ran away as fast as we could. Andrew and Baden had clocked it in terms of visually, and they said it was an olive python, which then went into the water, which we were going into. There's a couple of things in that. It is scary, but once it passes on, I was thinking, we're going into that water. And it does cross your mind, but you really get so primal out there in terms of once it's challenge on, your brain changes. And there is no way in God's earth I would ever swim in a river that I couldn't see through. It's not the Maldives or something. And you literally just jump in there and you go to this vision and this predatory kind of way out there, and it's just primal. And stripping away everything else, you really do just get primal. And I'm super competitive, so you just forget about all that. There was another time that was really probably the worst one. We were actually in the brain camp, and Georgia was not very well. And I had my buff and I was getting water and mopping her brow. And Laura was like taking a pulse because she's done diving and she's really good at being kind of first responder. And I think Rach must have been just cradling her or something like that. Anyway, I stepped back to get more water for my buff for her face. And as I did that, there was we believe it was a teen brown snake, which apparently the most, I'll come back to the teen part of the brown snake in a second, but it went across Laura's foot and went into the shelter. and we all freaked out. Understandably, it was really, really stressful. Georgia was ill. We're all trying to manage it. None of us really slept much that night. And we got Larry, the legend, who's the snake guy. He came in and combed it, and no one could really find it. So the ones that they can't find are the ones that the issue. I did notice as we started to go through the game more, originally you'd see lots of snake trails in front of the camp when you woke up, and it did seem to get less. I don't know if because the fire was stoked higher, or there was more of us, or I don't know, fecal matter around, or weed, or whatever. And sorry, just going back to, I found out that the brown snakes, the teen ones, they're not very good at controlling their bites, and they have a bit more venom and are a bit more dangerous. Whereas an older brown snake might stick its fangs in you, but not produce any venom at that point in time. They just want to give you a little scare. But the little teen ones can't control themselves.
Obviously, you were aligned with the biggest snake in the game, though, in George. But staying on the topic of the snakes in the environment, obviously being in the outback Cloncurry, what was it? How hot did it get? How cold did it get? How did you pack as well? I heard some people bought merino wool. Did you bring merino wool? Or how did you prepare for the cold?
I investigated the wazoo out of everything. Everything I wore was strategic. I had a pair of shorts which had pockets in them. And the reason if I was finding idols, I could put them in pockets. And they would also they'd also act, because you don't have undies and things like that. So I could wear some shorts, and if I could wash my undies, and I actually had cozies at that point, then I could. One of my cozies was reversible, so I'd literally wear it one way, I'd wash it and put it back on the other way in the lagoon. I had, what else did I have? I had a leather jacket with a hood, and it had padding, and it had about 8 different pockets as well. And that was so I could roll it up into a pillow if I needed, and also keep obviously my head warm. And then I had a merino. I had the highest GSM merino that you could possibly get in another hoodie. And then I had merino pants. I had merino socks, and you're allowed your water shoes and your sneakers. And that's right. And I had my skirt, which I wasn't really fussed on wearing, but they wanted me to wear a skirt. And I had my my white linen shirt. Originally, I had asked to have a light blue one, but I realized that Mitch and I would have looked like the Bobbsey twins if we both wore what we had wanted to wear, because we both looked like that. So I had to switch to my white one, but that was to keep off the sun, to keep cool. Yeah, and then I had my masseur sandals, because it's really important to keep your feet protected and to give them a break if they're wet, to give them an air out. So I took my masseur sandals, which I don't know if you follow me on Instagram, but George loved them so much. He used to go out, he's like, I would have used the pea sandals, Cara. So, and Kez was using them as pea sandals at one point. And George came home and bought a pair. He bought a black pair. It's like his going out pair.
Did you were you one of the castaways that spoke to Pia Miranda before you went out there? Because I heard that she gave a few people advice in regards to taking merino wool out there.
Oh no, I didn't. No, I actually tried buffalo wool. So I researched this particular type of buffalo wool that you can get in America, and I was trying to get a poncho in. And they have these riding kind of blanket ponchos that I think the American Indians wear, or they also wear them for they have them in movie shows. I tried to get that approved, but they're like, no, it's too much like a blanket, and it really was. It kept the water off, if I could get it. So this was all this buffalo stuff. So no, I wouldn't have gone to the end of Buffalo land to get anything if I'd known about the merino. Merino was like a backstep for me.
Well, for anybody listening to this, when you go out there, apparently merino wool is the one you want. I think if you look at the Pia Miranda interview that we did earlier in the year, she talks about what is the best clothing to wear to try and stay dry out there. Now, I know that being out in the outback and where you guys were at, you didn't really see rain until quite late within the game. What was it like when it finally started raining? Was that difficult to deal with? And do you feel like other survivors might give you guys a little bit of stick because you didn't have to go through such a wet season?
Oh, so I do comprehend the wet season and how difficult it would be. Like, it is a bit of a morale booster, and we did have the one day. It was like a day and a half where it rained, and our shelter was not really geared for it. So we had to kind of rebuild it. We were trying to pack it in and trying to make it work. But at that point, I think there was only 6 or 7 of us left, and so we kind of just muddled through, and it did get obviously warm after it finished. The hardest part was actually like drinking water. You just couldn't get enough water in. I don't know if you look at us in all the challenges, we're constantly like licking our lips and you're just constantly thirsty. And we were drinking like 4 liters of water like a day, and it still wasn't enough. And initially, because the production was so used to, you know, people having coconuts and fruit and things like that and not supplying any water. At one point, they, unbeknownst to them, didn't realize how much we needed. And they were just giving us, you know, in terms of extra water, you know, just a little bit. So it was interesting when they started to realize we really needed it. But then at night, it was freezing. And you feel... it's so, I can't even describe how cold it is. Do you guys watch Game of Thrones with the Night King?
Yep.
Yes.
You feel like that, and your bones hurt so much because they're so brittle. There was one of the last nights at Tribal, it was 7 degrees without the wind chill, and the wind was really whipping up that day. So it ended up being, I think it was 0. And to be out there with nothing, no food, no fat on you, you know, I was sleeping so close to the fire at one stage that... has anyone told you this story? Can I segue off?
Yes, go into it. I saw it on social media, but for people who don't know about this, Cara's going to go into how George saved her life out there.
Yes, George saved my life. Yes. So I'm lying there next to Gerald in Brain 2.0. And George was on the other side. And Gerald used to put a rock as a pillow, and he'd sleep on that with his head towards the fire. And I was like, well, a rock can't be that comfortable. And I had my knapsack, my bag. And George was up because we would strategize all night. Every waking hour, he would come up with like 50 plans. I'd quash like 47 of them. Then I'd come up with a few, and then we'd workshop them, all the different scenarios, because we like to play it out. So you'd sleep a few hours a night. Excuse me, a few hour blocks each night. Anyway, George is up, and he's like looking down at me. He's like, "Cara, your hair's on fire." I'm like, "What?" Anyway, I jumped up, and my bag was on fire. And it actually went through to my cosy bottoms, and they all kind of melted. So I didn't have any proper cozies for the end part of it. I only had my bike shorts, thank God. And I had all black holes in my bag, and everything kept falling out, and I kept dropping everything. And if you drop anything and lose it out there, it's devastating morally. I lost 3 hairbands. And I was using Rachel's cozies that she'd left behind. I'd cut them up and using them as hair ties because you need them for challenges and things like that. And then anything you lose is just devastating. Anyway, my bag had so many holes in it. George says he saved my life. He probably came close to that, but I think he almost tried to kill me a couple of times as well. He's dangerous to be around camp, but funny. And circling back to that, George is fun and funny and self-effacing, and you know he puts on a good show. He knows how to do a soundbite, but he's sweet and charming and intelligent, and we all have so many different facets to ourselves, and we should try not judge people like so quickly. Is probably the moral to that story. Going back.
I think fans wise, George has got a lot of fans. Like, I was the number 1 fanboy here on this podcast. In any case, I love George. I think he's a great character, and I've had the wee tweet here and there back and forth between me and him as well. He's quite a fun character, I can tell just by that. But going into George, you mentioned that he believes he saved your life there, but we do know that he did save your life in the game. He did repay the favor later on with the special idol, and that was a plan. You said you kind of shut down quite a lot of plans. plans and you were aware of most of it, but you weren't aware of that plan going into it and that he was going to play it. How aware were you that the votes were going to come your way that episode? And did you think that was the end for you? And, going back into that, going to camp and then finding out that George did this, and he wants you to say that you played it, talk us through the process of trying to sort of take the blame away from George. And did you really think that people were going to believe him?
Oh, not really, but it's worth a shot, So I knew something was up with George because I can just tell. And I knew a lot of votes were coming my way. But George he was just he was nudging me at Tribal. He's like, trust me. And he's like, Laura. I'm like, yeah, I know. We discussed it. But I didn't know what. I didn't know what exactly he had up his sleeve. And, in hindsight, I do wonder if he was just keeping his powder dry just in case, but maybe reading how it was going to be right there. But I also trusted him, and he and I knew we'd always said we'd tell the truth to each other, which is, to me, a true friendship, good and bad. Like, there was some plans he was making, and I was like, mate, you do you. I will back you up. But, I just want to stick loyal with my, alliance side at the moment because I just want to stick on loyalty. But I just didn't betray his confidence, but I knew what was going on. But it worked out perfectly because he would run away on his side. I would run away on my side. And we kept kind of coming back and circling back together and knowing each other's plans. That was one I knew. I had an inkling I was safe, but I wasn't 100% sure because you never are. But I knew George had my back, but I just didn't know what. But we do joke. Every time we joke, we're like, Laura! And I'm like, I get it, mate. And he just kept turning around and going, Laura! I'm like, yeah, like I'm not an idiot. Anyway, so we had discussed Laura prior, just because she was always a target, frankly, because she was also, she's really good at relationships. She's a lovely girl. So you just never know where she might pop up in a new alliance or, being friends with someone. So she was just always an obvious target for that.
You didn't experience many rewards in the game at all. I think in total you experienced 3, and one of those came on day 38 when you correctly picked Flick, Way, and Danny to win that challenge. How depleted were you at that point, and how nice was it, I suppose, to get away from camp and have that reward there?
I was really depleted, and I did really need some food. But I'm also really careful in that you have to be careful after you haven't eaten for so long. I'm not really good at starting up and eating a whole heap. It does make you sick. After most of the challenges, most of us pretty much threw up and were sick for a little while after. I found out later your intestines kind of break down because you're just used to one thing without any, any of the good bacteria or bad bacteria in there. I was so grateful, and you do feel replenished, but equally sick. So you're like, sometimes it's better the devil you know or the devil you don't. I still eat rice and lentils like 3 or 4 times a week. I just kind of zhuzh them up now, and the kids are like, I can't believe you're still doing that. But I think it's kind of that institutionalized thing. Now I put a bit of rocket, a bit of salt. You're craving salt out there, and some chili. I love it.
Now, I do have a question for you on Laura. You mentioned that she was always the target, and we can see that because you voted for her 6 times before she actually went out, which is more than anybody else. I did notice that Laura was one of the few people who voted for George at the end as well. Did you form a bit of a relationship with Laura at the Ponderosa where you guys could talk about what George did in the game, and were you sort of vocal for George there in Ponderosa when you were talking to her, or was that just something that she completely did on her own? Because it was a bit left-sided, especially because they also seem to be going at each other for most of the game.
Yeah, no, Laura and I never ever spoke any strategy at all. I was always friendly with her. I'm friendly with frankly everyone, and until they really badly cross me, then I might change my mind. But she was playing her own game. I very rarely knew what she was doing or why she was doing it. She's just a nice girl, and I know toward the end there when she was kind of solo, I just actually give her a hug and say, you're okay, because we're all human, and it's not the Hunger Games, So, like, I just as a human to human, I would just check in and chat to her then. But in terms of her strategy, we never spoke about strategy at all, ever.
It did become a little bit like the Hunger Games there towards the end, especially at the final four, where Haley almost, obviously tried to convince you to turn on George at that point. Had that been something you considered doing at an early stage in the game? Had you considered that you would eventually have to cut George in the game? And what was
Yeah.
what was the outlook on the final two, and who were you going to bring?
Okay, so first question first. Haley didn't convince me to vote for George. I knew I was going to have to go against George at some point. The way I had set it up is I had organised for all of them to take me to final two because I didn't think I was ever going to win. Like, if you can imagine who I was up against, if Flick had gone through against me, she would have won. She had the jury sweetheart vote. If George had gone against me, I think people would have seen his strategy and his gameplay because I was behind the scenes like a guiding mother, smoothing out relationships and all that. So it wasn't such an overt game, but I was never going to be that overt player. And then, so he would have won against me, and then Haley would have won against me because she's really good at challenges. Initially, Haley's strategy game was like a bit clumsy, and I used to help her with strategy and kind of relationships. But maybe she was dumbing it down in hindsight, I'm not sure. But obviously she got herself voted off, and Redemption Rock was what saved her then. So the final four for me, my decision came down to if Flick hadn't won immunity, she would have gone home for sure. She would have been gone because everyone knew. Because she won immunity, I then only had Haley or George to vote for. Now, my original thinking was I needed Haley to I needed Haley to beat Flick at the final challenge and take me. And then I actually thought, you know what, I should just back myself in that final challenge and just vote George out because I'm just going to have to vote George. So I was kind of the damned if you do, damned if you don't position. It certainly wasn't Haley that convinced me to vote for George. It was me actually just going, I'm going to have to do it sometime. Might as well back myself. I really, really wanted family visits. My husband and my son were up there, one of the 4 families waiting to see who got through. And of all the things in my whole Survivor tick box, I wanted them to come on and be part of the show. And of all the biggest regrets, it's that. I still lose sleep at night. Like, I would have loved to have done that challenge. I would have loved to do it. But the other thing is George and I, because we still strategize about everything, about going back. A lot of people don't know that I was so injured this whole... Can I continue on? Sorry.
Yeah, go for it.
So I
go
can
for
it. There was the challenge where we were on the wheels and we had to place the balls around, and that went on for so long. We were out there for 2 hours, and that actually shortened it on television. And it looked like the other tribe had thrown it, and to some degree they had. But it was at that point that Gerald picked me up in a bear hug, and he actually dislocated my rib. So for the rest of the show, and even for, frankly, there was probably another 2 months after I left, I really struggled with my rib and challenges and swimming. I was getting really fearful, even though my fitness was getting up in the game. My rib was really, really bad. So I subluxed my 5th, and you may understand now when people are saying I was really weak in the challenge where we were we were standing on the skis, if you will, holding our own body weight above it. I was almost vomiting after like 2 minutes, and it was my cartilage was being pulled apart. So I was disappointed, and I always, of all the things, I think George said to me on the final challenge, your rib would have like affected you, and like I still would have loved to do it anyway. But I also wonder the effect it might have had in my game if I had not dislocated my rib.
So for any of those people that listened to the recording version of this, Gerald will be on our next interview for Australian Survivor. So Riley, mark that down. We'll ask him why you try to take out the Brains players here. It's play the game, not the man or the woman in this case. So we'll definitely bring that up. But Cara, obviously with these challenges, they were very lopsided towards the physical side of things. Were you surprised that the challenges didn't incorporate a little bit more of the Brains aspect because it was a Brains versus Brawns season?
Yeah, so I definitely was, and some days it was frustrating. Probably my lowest moment was trying to put those sticks together to get the peg off. I just couldn't get out of the gate with that, and I was hungry and I was tired, and of all the things I wanted to do the day spa and the champagne. I was begging JLP the whole game. I'm like, do you have champagne? Do you have French champagne? I want the day spa, because you just feel better, right? And forgive me, I just digressed. What was the second part of your question then?
So the question was, were you surprised that it was so Brawn heavy opposed to Brains in a season that is Brains versus Brawns?
Yeah. So in hindsight, Brains, to some degree, having Brains and using Brains in strategy and relationships is so multi-dimensional, but Brawn is kind of one-dimensional. And if they hadn't have seemingly balanced it more Brawns like that, more Brawn at that stage, I think the Brawn would have gone a lot earlier, because the brain, or the people with the brains, were running rings around the Brawn in terms of strategies. We were thinking a lot more moves ahead. We were thinking about what would happen, who would align with who. We were reading people. I'm constantly reading body language. I'm watching people. Whereas, the Brawn didn't like to strategize so much. So at the time when you're in it, you think, frustrating. But in hindsight, I think it became fair by the nature of it that Brains were always probably going to run rings around, the Brawn, because it's one-dimensional. And I'm not saying they are one-dimensional. I'm just saying winning a challenge, there is more to Survivor than winning a challenge. It is about relationships. It is about alliances. It's keeping open your bridges. It's putting yourself out there for your team. It's loyalty. Like it's so much more than literally physically winning a challenge. And that's why, in the end, in hindsight, when you're out of it and you can think clearly, I think the imbalance was strategic.
You mentioned a little bit earlier that you and George are already strategizing on potentially coming back. Three-phase question here. One, would you come back? Two, maybe for a blood versus water season, maybe George brings Dougie and you bring one of your children. And three, how did your children receive you and watching you on TV kick ass out there?
Yeah. Oh, you're very kind. Thank you. So I'll just correct you on that. We strategize about what happened before, not about coming back, although we do talk about it. What a lot of people don't know is the actual stress it puts on your family. It literally feels like a death for you to be out there for so long and not to be able to communicate. It's affected my family. I'm not going to say negatively, but it was hard to get back in and assimilate back in for me, because everyone was, not upset. It's just hard to have a blackout period and people come back and you slot into your life. It's like, imagine if you had a girlfriend, boyfriend or whatever, and they leave and they come back and you're like, you got to try and readjust to everything. Even the cat has taken like probably 3 months to get used to me again. So I actually just want to say it's really tough for the people left behind, because it's a blackout. When you're in the game, you go primal. All you think about is fire, shelter, the challenges, and just getting another step ahead, another day. My whole mantra was, I'm not going to die, I'm not going to die, I'm not going to die. And so would I do it again? It's really taxing. I would have to see, never say never, I suppose, but it's really tough on the people you leave behind. And it's kind of nice you leave a big hole, but I would love to do it if I wasn't affected so much by the people I left behind, because I love the game.
And I think it's tough also for you to answer that question so soon after just playing. Like, I had Harry Hills on the podcast a few times. He's a great friend of the podcast, actually. And also, if anybody's listening, congratulations to Harry Hills for just getting married, I believe, over the weekend. So,
gorgeous.
Yeah, so cool. And he talks about. Sorry, you go ahead.
I was going to say with numbers. Excuse me, I spoke over the top of you.
Yeah, so basically he talks about how difficult it is to play the game back to back because he had to do it when he went out there to play a game again, and mentally and physically he wasn't in the right space for it. So I guess if we're ever lucky enough to get a Cara 2.0 interview, we'll ask you again in a year or 2 years from now, and maybe the answer will be different at that point. I do want to ask you as a bit of a it's probably your second or third last question here, because I think there's one more question I'd like to ask after that, if you don't mind. But, there was a couple of different iterations of potential final twos here. We got the the Hayley versus George final two, and you voted for George. You mentioned that George, in your mind, played one of the best games of Australian Survivor, which I'm very high on his game as well. So I don't think that's an unfair assessment. Obviously, Hayley played a very good game as well, and just having those two there was always going to be tough. What do you think would have happened if George went up against Flick? I'm assuming he would have still had your vote. And if Flick went up against Hayley, what is the different scenarios there? How do you think the jury would have perceived those Flick versus Hayley and Flick versus George at the final? Do you think the results would have been different?
Flick would have always won. Flick would have always won. Everyone loves Flick. She's an amazing girl. Like, I love her. She's actually just a sweetheart. She's driven. She's strong. She's she's got her hurts, and she's obviously had been going through and still going through to some degree some of the family situation. She has this innate being to make people want to look after her and be friends with her. She's one of those type of people, and her big wave surfing. She's just an amazing human being. And I'm not saying she's flawless, but she didn't upset anybody. She was really good with the challenges. She was just a nice girl all round. I'm not saying Hayley wasn't nice, because Hayley's also lovely. I get the chance to see her and Jimmy when I can, obviously subject to lockdown. But Flick was the sweetheart and darling of the jury. It was always going to be Flick if she got through.
Yeah, that's kind of what we thought as viewers as well, watching the show. So I do have a question here. Who would you love to see go out there and represent your season in an all-star season? If you had to select someone pre-merge that didn't quite make the merge, and one after the merge, but for after the merge, I don't want you to include any of the people that I think you'd include, like George or Hayley, or Flick, because Flick is so well liked. Who do you think after the merge you'd love to go out there and represent your season, and who would you like to see pre-merge go back and play another time as well?
So can I add an extra? Obviously Hayley, for sure. She's an amazing player. She's an easy one, but did you discount her from my list?
So Hayley, let's keep the final three out of it. So if it's anybody not in the final three, who would you love to see go back?
I would have loved to have seen Shannon go further. And go back and play All Stars. She's so smart, and she's so self-effacing, and she's gorgeous, and she's a real team corraller and nurturer. And frankly, I would have loved to have seen Simon go again. I just think he. I know he went out with 2 idols, and it kills me to say it, and I tease him about it. I actually spoke to him the other day. He's getting married soon too. But probably those two, Simon and Shannon. Simon deserved a lot more credit for what he was doing than what he did. He was just kind of a bit more innocent. I think if he went back in, he'd have his more of his wiles about him. You just can't rest on your laurels. That's my mantra to everyone. You've just got to hustle. You've just got to work and grind, and you can't ever be complacent. And it was the complacent ones that usually made the errors.
I feel like you've used your empath skills on me right here in the interview, because those are my 2 favorite players from the pre-merge section of the game. And, let's hope they go out there and they can find a way to work together this time around instead of going after each other in the game as well. Cara, it's been lovely having you here on the interview today. We've really enjoyed this. I hope that in the future at some point you'd be happy to talk about Blood versus Water when it comes out. We'd love to talk some Survivor, and it's maybe a little bit easier if you come on the podcast not having to worry about how people are perceiving your gameplay and your moves, and it's easier to be like myself and Riley, armchair critics, instead of being out there playing the game.
I really appreciate it. I've really enjoyed talking to you guys, and who knows next time.
Thank you very much, and we'll talk to you again next time. Have a good evening on that side, and really appreciate you taking the time to talk to us.
Lovely to chat.
Thanks, Cara.
Good night.
Thanks.